Hi everybody, Professor Cruz here. Welcome to our week one lecture for Religion, Ethics, and Ecology, where we're jumping into thinking about what does it mean to talk about or think about ethics and ethical actions, ethical decision making, and related ideas. So in part of what we read for this week from Ethics Very Short Introduction by Simon Blackburn, he describes our moral or our ethical environment as the surrounding climate of ideas about how to live. And he says that it determines what we find acceptable or unacceptable, admirable or contemptible. And basically, it gives us our standards and our standards of behavior, most importantly. Now, we all have an ethical environment that informs our actions, but we're not always conscious of how these sort of deeper ethical environments shape our daily actions. And that's something we'll want to think about over the course of the next several weeks. So he gives an example of an experience he had being on a radio program talking about philosophy. And someone called in and was basically quite strongly arguing that during the World War II persecution of Jews under Nazi Germany, that philosophy was essentially a worthless enterprise because it couldn't help those Jews that were on their way to the concentration camps. And as Blackburn muses, well, that may be true on a superficial level, but nothing would have helped you in terms of knowledge at that point. But importantly, he says the study of ethics can actually tell us a lot about the underlying ethical environment that actually gave birth to Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. Because as he argues, these events didn't take place in a moral vacuum. And there actually philosophy and ethics can be quite important to help us understand how did this come about and how was it maintained. So as he notes, in short, Hitler could come to power only because people did think, but their thinking was poisoned by an enveloping climate of ideas, many of which may not even have been conscious of. For we may not be aware of our ideas. And this is really an important part of what we want to think about over the course of this semester, is how do we interrogate our own ideas and values that we may not even be conscious that we're holding or why we hold them. So we could think about contemporary politics today, where we see millions of Americans who continue to believe, without any evidence, that the 2020 election was rigged. So rather than accepting the fact that a majority of Americans rejected Trump's second election at the ballot box and instead chose Biden and Harris, instead we see individuals arguing for some kind of an elaborate deep state conspiracy to deny Trump a second term. So to try to understand where do these kind of unfounded conspiratorial beliefs come from, we need to understand that deeper ethical environment that they are a product of. So as Blackburn notes, an ethical climate is a different thing from a moralistic one. Indeed, one of the marks of an ethical climate may be hostility to moralizing. We tend to think that modern constitutional democracies like the United States are fine regardless of the private vices of those within them. We are much more nervous talking about our good. It seems moralistic or undemocratic or even elitist. Similarly, we are nervous talking about duty. And here he's reflecting on how different our modern thinking is about these questions. Things like what is the good life or what is our duty, which were really driving foundational concepts in early philosophy as Greeks and later philosophers understood them. So as we'll see over the next several weeks, this distinction between ethical thinking and moralizing is an important one. Because the philosophical study of morality, which is what we refer to as ethics, really seeks to understand what we believe and why. So in other words, ethics really requires the act of critical self-reflection. By contrast, telling someone that your beliefs are right and that theirs are wrong without presenting a compelling argument, that's really the hallmark of moralizing. I'm telling you that what you believe is wrong and what I believe is right, but I don't necessarily need to convince you of that fact. So humans are ethical animals, suggests Blackburn, and in fact, we prefer that our preferences are shared. And in fact, we turn these preferences into demands on each other. And this is one of the reasons that these unquestioned ethical environments can easily turn into moralizing or worse, as we saw earlier with the example of the Nazis. So reflecting on our own ethical environment is an important step in trying to kind of prevent not only the sloppy thinking, but to better understand our own value systems. So as Blackburn suggests, philosophy is an enterprise of knowledge. After all, Philosophy, philosophos, the love of knowledge or love of wisdom, is where we get this term from. And it seeks to understand the springs of motivation, reason, and feeling that move us, to understand the networks of rules or norms that sustain our lives. And these deeper reflections can obviously take many forms. You don't need to be a professional philosopher to reflect deeply on ethics and why you believe what you do. And in fact, over the next couple of weeks, we'll be doing precisely that. And none of us need to be philosophers. In fact, an old roommate of mine who had spent many years as a chef in the restaurant industry, he often told me that his undergraduate BA degree in philosophy was really the best training he could have ever got for being a chef. So why is that? Well, if you think about it, this process of trial and error that you go through as a chef in a kitchen, making up new dishes, serving them to people, having them try them, and then give you feedback, that's very similar to how philosophers and ethicists work through philosophical and ethical ideas. Those ideas that stick, similar to the food that people enjoy, are those that then become the proverbial ethical menu, or as we're talking about, the sort of broader ethical environment of our society. But Blackburn also suggests that ethics can be disturbing. And this is especially true when the ethical questions that we're considering cause us to confront what might be uncomfortable truths about our own core beliefs. So, in this search for ethical foundations, Blackburn suggests that sometimes defensively, we get angry when such things are brought up. But this defensiveness is, I would argue, natural. So, the challenge for us is to figure out how do we sit with these ethical uneasinesses, and how do we do that without shutting down our ability to continue thinking critically about the topics that we're reflecting on? Because ultimately, every one of us has a story that we tell ourselves to help make sense of the world, our worldview or our broader ethical environment, as Blackburn calls it. And by reflecting on ethics, we can help better understand that story that we've told ourselves. And as he notes, racists and sexists, like antebellum slave owners in America, always have to tell themselves a story that justifies their system. The ethical climate will sustain a conviction that we are civilized and they are not, or that we deserve better futures than they, or that we are the intelligent, sensitive, rational, progressive, scientific, or blessed ones alone trusted with certain freedoms and rights, while they are not. So this ethic gone wrong is an essential preliminary, he argues, to the sweatshop or the concentration camp or even the death march. So over these next few weeks, we'll be exploring a variety of topics with these sort of challenges in mind. Some of the themes we'll be exploring may hit close to home and make you uncomfortable, and others may be entirely new and things you've not given any thought to before. But not to worry, this is all a natural part of our critical reflection on our own ethical environments. And it's precisely through this sort of self-reflective exercises that we'll hopefully gain a better understanding of what we believe and why, and what our core beliefs are. And in fact, the exercises we'll be doing, both the case studies and the personal ethics statements, are really geared to helping us try to think through reflectively about these beliefs and how we came to have them and what informs our thinking about them. Now, Blackburn, in the excerpts that we read, talks about a number of what he calls threats to ethics. And we looked at 3 of those in our readings the beginning of this week. And the first one is what he calls the death of God. So he argues for many people, ethics is not only tied up with religion, but it's completely settled by it. Such people do not need to think too much about ethics because there is an authoritative code of instruction, a handbook of how to live. It's a word of heaven or the will of a being greater than ourselves. Now, as Blackburn suggests, as many of you likely know, for many religious people, sacred texts like the Bible or the Torah or the Quran or the Vedas, they tell us all we need to know about ethical systems and frameworks coming out of those traditions. In fact, as Blackburn argues, in other words, we drape our own standards with the stories of divine origin as a way of asserting their authority. So we tell ourselves a story about ethics that is then reflected back in these religious texts. God says to do this, and therefore we do this. Or we do this, and therefore it must be something sanctioned by God. Now, for those of you that have studied philosophy, you may be familiar with Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, where we find the figure of Socrates involved in a prolonged debate with a Greek prophet, a young individual by the name of Euthyphro, over this question of piety or holiness. And this was one of the sort of the early attempts among Greek philosophers to work through this kind of question about how do ethics and religion, or ethics and the mandates of the gods, fit together. Now, we didn't read this, but Socrates doesn't really give a final answer in the dialogues, but rather what he suggests is that in that context, no good answer could be given. But he does suggest that people tend to find a way to justify their arguments and to say that they are acting justly or piously or holy, even if they're not. And that too often these justifications can revert to a kind of crude, well, because the gods said so argument that shuts down further conversation. Now, for millennium, we know that religion has played an important role in the story of morality. But in the last decade or two, or I'm sorry, the last century or two, let's say maybe in the late 17 to the mid 1800s, as we're kind of moving out of the Enlightenment period and into the Industrial Revolution, these foundations started to weaken under a whole onslaught of philosophical and social changes in society that were in part tied to the weakening of religious institutions, and particularly in Europe, the weakening of the Catholic Church and the splits between Catholics, Protestants, and other religious sects. So, for example, we can look at a figure like Russian novelist Dostoevsky, who famously suggested in his 1879 novel, The Brothers Karamazov, that if God is dead, then everything is permitted. And this kind of reflected this emerging ethos that raised the question of, do we need religion to help ground our ethics? And this really goes to the heart of a lot of the issues that we'll be thinking about over the next 3 weeks, and which dominate many of our debates around ethics today, which is it possible to ground our ethical thinking and ethical frameworks without reference to religion or some sort of higher powers? Now, as numerous writers and critics have suggested over the centuries, belief in God by itself doesn't automatically ensure that we will be moral actors or that religious believers will act morally. In fact, there's a long history of religious scandals and other examples we could point to that suggest otherwise. And interestingly, Blackburn argues that there may be situations where actually an over-reliance on religion to ground our ethics could actually be a hindrance to ethical inquiry, particularly if religious arguments about what is right or wrong are basically just uncritically embraced as old myths and prejudices that were handed down to us by an earlier generation. So without really reflecting on them, we've just kind of accepted them as given. So as Blackburn suggests, if all this is right, then the death of God is far from being a threat to ethics. In fact, it's a necessary clearing of the ground on the way to revealing what really, are at the heart of ethics. Perhaps there cannot be laws without a lawgiver, he argues, referencing back to the discussion with Ivan in Dostoevsky's book. But Plato tells us that ethical laws cannot be the arbitrary whims of personalized gods. Maybe instead we can make our own laws. So if that's true, we need to look elsewhere for ethical guidance to decide what is right and what is wrong. And part of this philosophical search, from Plato through Kant to contemporary philosophy, involves this quest or this search for a universal moral standard to ground our ethics and our ethical decisions, what Kant called the categorical imperative. And it would be a universal ethical standard that should apply across time and space that we could all somehow agree on. But most people would agree that this search for a universal ethical foundation, despite many attempts over the years, has largely remained elusive. And one of the reasons for that, Blackburn mentions, is that finding a common ethical framework across cultures has proven quite difficult. And this gets us to the second of the threats to ethics that Blackburn talks about, which is relativism. Now, as Blackburn argues, if we can't look to God for ethics, perhaps we are faced simply with rules of our own making. Well, then the thought arises that the rules may be made in different ways by different people at different times. And if that's the case, it seems to follow that there is no one truth, or you might say a capital T truth. There are only the different truths of different communities. This is the idea of relativism. So this idea, very simply, is to think about the difference between a capital T truth and sort of a lowercase t truth. One being authoritative and the other one being sort of particular. Now, Blackburn suggests that there's a certain appeal to this idea of cultural relativism in ethics because, on the surface at least, it seems to celebrate this acceptance of diversity and difference that we associate with more open and inclusive liberal societies today. After all, isn't it the great promise of the American democracy of liberty and justice for all? But the risk here is that this kind of relativism can easily slip into claims that because ethics or value judgments are culturally relevant and culturally bounded, then one cultural group can't really make observations and critiques of other cultures because they're operating from different standards. And the result is that you get this inability to speak critically about anything beyond your own cultural framework. So if it's not my own ethical environment, then in a sense, I can't speak to it. But the question is, does this kind of extreme cultural relativism really make sense? And Blackburn argues, not really. And in fact, even this kind of supposed, what he refers to as kind of the freshman cultural relativism itself is actually more bounded and limited than we tend to recognize. So he says, so we're faced with a distinction between the transcultural requirement, we need some way of coping with death, and the local implementation. This is the way we have hit upon. This is what qualifies the relativism. If everybody needs a rule, that there should be some rule, that itself represents a universal standard. And the core of ethics is universal in just this way. So in a sense, yes, there are cultural differences, but there may be some sort of core threads that run through even those differences. So we might think about this idea of universal ethical ideas in concepts like rights or justice. And we might assume that there may not be one right way to define what rights are or what justice looks like. So maybe the idea of justice is universal, but how we concretely define justice in specific cultural terms is going to be different. And those will reflect our different ethical environments. So consider a very simple example involving food. So in India, where Hindu is sort of the dominant religious belief, cows are considered sacred animals and play an important role in earlier Vedic and contemporary Hindu traditions. And in fact, there are both legal and religious prohibitions against harming and eating cows. Conversely, in the United States, where you have much more of a secular and sort of Protestant Christian influence in terms of the background cultural environment, eating a cheeseburger or a ribeye steak is totally normal. But if you were to go to a McDonald's in India, you could order a McSpicy chicken or a McSpicy paneer, but not a Big Mac or a quarter pounder with cheese. And it's precisely because of these different cultural differences. But would we think that eating a Big Mac has anything to do with justice? Maybe not. But that's in part because here in the United States, people don't put the same value on cows as they do, at least among Hindus in India. So the cultural and religious environments are different. So this begs the question, can eating a hamburger be both a just and an unjust act at the same time, seen across two different cultures? Now, obviously, the McDonald's example is a kind of silly one in a sense because there's not really much at stake in the question. Most people, I think, would agree that we would be hard-pressed to argue that there was some injustice or that we were somehow being treated unjustly because we couldn't order a Big Mac at McDonald's in India. But there are lots of other examples of cultural relativism being applied that have much higher stakes, where people's lives are on the line. So consider, for example, case of Hong Kong and recent events in the last year that have kind of been a response to the new security laws put in place by mainland China to help both consolidate China's influence over Hong Kong, but also to try to quelch sort of growing pro-democracy movement, particularly among young people in Hong Kong. So, for example, pro-democracy youth activists Agnes Chow, Ivan Lam, and Joshua Wong, you can see pictured here in the slide, were each charged under a new Chinese security law this past fall in 2020 and sentenced to between 10 months and a little over 1 year in prison. And their crime essentially was organizing unauthorized rallies and encouraging people to come and attend those rallies. Now, seeing young people sent to prison simply for expressing their political views and arguing that democracy is a political good and something that is valuable in Hong Kong, many of us would say that being arrested for that seems unjust and unfair. But a strong cultural relativist might disagree and say, well, that's an internal cultural matter to China and it should be left to Chinese to decide. But as Blackburn argues, isn't something like the denial of basic human rights everyone's concern, and not just limited to the borders of nation states? So, for example, he talks about the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights and this idea that there may be some core universal values that run through and provide some kind of threads for the idea of a universal ethics, of which basic human rights might be one of them. But even here, Blackburn wonders, but are they any more than just ours, just now? And again, here he's referring to this Declaration of Human Rights. And if we cannot see them as more than that, then who are we to impose them on others? Multiculturalism seems to block liberalism. So this tension between the universal and the particular is at the heart of a lot of ethical debates, particularly around relativism. Blackburn wonders, can we find arguments to unsettle the relativist frame of mind? Can we do more than thump the table? And if we can't, does that mean we have to stop thumping it? Well, he argues the answer is yes, we can do more. And we can respond to these kind of cross-cultural ethical issues without getting stuck in either a sort of seesaw of relativism or a complete subjectivism, by which he means, everyone is entitled to their own opinion and there is no such thing as a standard for anyone. It's just, I believe what I believe, you believe what you believe, and everyone will have their own sort of way. So how do we do that? How do we navigate these sort of relativist tensions? Well, one way we can possibly do that is by offering support to, for example, internal struggles in Hong Kong for democracy without trying to forcibly impose our own cultural values or views. So as Blackburn argues, it's a question of cooperating with the oppressed and supporting their emancipation. And as he goes on to say, after all, it's typically only the oppressors who are spokespersons for their culture or their way of doing it. It's not the slaves who value slavery, or the women who value the fact that they may not take employment, or the young girls who value disfigurement. It's the Brahmins, the mullahs, the priests, and elders who hold themselves to be the spokespersons for their culture. So this gets into an important question about power and how power shapes questions of ethics, and we'll be looking about sort of exploring those questions more later on this semester. So the third challenge that we read about from Blackburn this week to ethics is egoism. So as I've said, we've looked at sort of the questions of religious groundings and ethics without religion, as well as how relativism poses certain challenges. But what about us, the people at the center of these debates? Why do we care about ethics? What reasons do we have to think or act ethically? And perhaps as, or maybe more important, how can we tell if our own sort of ethical claims match our actions? So we may say we believe X, but do our actions reflect that? So Blackburn suggests there are two fairly good methods for finding out what people actually care about. One is to ask them and then gauge the sincerity of their responses and the plausibility of what they say. The other is to see what they do and try to do. And as he notes, neither method is infallible because people may deceive us and we may deceive ourselves. So we all like to think of ourselves as ethical, or at least I would argue most people do. And we like to think of ourselves as holding ourselves to certain ethical standards or moral standards. But what we say we believe and how we act are sometimes in sort of tension. So, you pick up a newspaper or you're scrolling through your news feeds or social media, you see the news is full of stories of politicians and businessmen who are doing unethical things left and right to further their own self-interest, but all the while claiming to be, upright, moral actors, and in fact, attacking other people for supposed moral infractions. In fact, some people would argue it's become sort of a truism, more like a popular saying in US politics today, that politicians abandon their morals sort of at the drop of a dime when they have the first chance to get more power and more control. So if that's true, or even partly true, can we really say that self-interest gives us a compelling reason to act ethically? And here Blackburn is skeptical. And in fact, he argues that such claims often rely on a kind of backward logic. By that he means, we say honesty is important because we want to be seen as honest, rather than because we genuinely value honesty. So our motivation for acting ethically isn't really because we value ethics. It's simply because we believe we need to be ethical. And of course, that goes to a much bigger discussion about, in a religious context, if you're not worried about punishment, let's say for Christians, if you're not worried about sin and going to hell, then what motivation do you have to act ethically? If not for the promise or the hope of salvation through accepting Jesus and going to heaven, what justifies acting good? What are the foundations that would cause us to say this matters beyond that threat of punishment? So these are some of the kind of questions that we're going to be thinking about over the next couple weeks. And in one of the other articles that I asked folks to read today from Megan Koester, this article, "Everything You Do is Unethical, so Get Off Your High Horse Already." In that she argues in the modern world, it's impossible to live ethically without going off the grid or killing yourself. If you did live off the grid, or didn't live, period, you wouldn't be reading this right now. Now, her piece is obviously sort of very hyperbolic with a lot of snark, but she does want to help us kind of think through a common misconception, which is that there's some way we can live a sort of 100% fully ethical life. And she says it's simply not possible. And I would agree. So she asks, for example, how do our individual choices around things like food or clothing or transportation or technology connect with larger ethical questions about how are those goods made, or what kind of labor conditions were required to produce that food or that piece of technology? Or, for example, how do we say that we care a lot about climate change while, binging Netflix that's run on coal-powered energy? So lots of conundrums here about how we navigate this desire to live ethically with the sort of constraints of the world and the broader background and ethical environment that we are a part of. Now, our case studies for this week will delve into a lot of the sort of political and social questions about this ongoing global coronavirus pandemic. And we'll ask a few, I think, important ethical questions to help get us sort of stewing in these kind of ideas. So how should we react to this case of Skylar Mack and Vijay Ramjeet in the Cayman Islands? How do you balance personal liberties, things that we hold very dear, with our duty to protect others, loved ones, and people in our community? How do we sort of think about our ethical obligations to strangers or immigrants? And do we have the same obligations to strangers and immigrants as we do to our friends and family? Not necessarily assuming that those are different groups, but how do we make these kind of distinctions about different people in society and how we apply ethical frameworks to them, particularly in the cases we'll see with the readings with immigrants that are here on cases of asylum or facing deportation. So these are just a few examples of the many kind of questions that will be informing our discussions over the next 3 weeks as we sort of jump into the beginning of our exploration of what does it mean to think and act ethically. Okay, that's it for this beginning week's lecture. I'll probably be doing 2 of these each week. One at the beginning of the week, kind of framing some of the big concepts that we're talking about. And then one later on in the sort of the mid or later part of the week, I'm reflecting on some of what you've been saying in the discussion forums and connecting to the readings as we progress through each week. So just a couple reminders, make sure that you've checked Blackboard every day and seen any updates there and are following the schedule, watching any videos, and done all the readings for each week. For this week, a reminder, so Monday we have our introductory videos due in the discussion forum. And then Tuesday, which is January 5th, we have our first kind of outline of the personal ethics statement, or our PETS, due on Blackboard. And then once you posted that, by Thursday, January 7th, you'll also want to comment on 3 other peers in your class. So pick 3 other people's posts, read through them, and give feedback on what they thought. Things that stand out for you, questions you had, things that maybe sparked your interest, things that maybe raised for you but they didn't discuss, and just kind of general reactions to that sort of outline. And then our first ethics in action case study, which again will be about coronavirus and some of the ethics around that, will be due Wednesday, January 6th by 11 in our Blackboard. And then similarly by Friday, January 8th, you'll want to read through other posts and respond to 3 of your peers, reflecting on their responses to these cases. And this will basically be our usual routine moving forward in weeks 2 and week 3, with the Tuesday for pets, Wednesday for the ethics case study, and then Thursday and Friday providing peer feedback on those posts. Okay, I look forward to hearing from all of you, seeing how you wrestle with these ideas, and we will be continuing this conversation more in the following days. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll talk to you again soon.